Evelyn's heart was awakened by relentless pounding on her front door in the early morning, the sound tearing through the quiet of the lakeside town. Within seconds, her daughter-in-law's voice rang out, sharp with anger, drawing attention as neighbors began stepping outside to witness the disturbance spreading across the street. Inside the dim house, Evelyn stood still behind the curtain. She did not respond. She did not move forward. She only listened as the chaos outside grew louder with every passing moment. Soon after, her son Marcus appeared, his breathing heavy, his eyes tight with a kind of strain that suggested he had already lost control. In his hand was a heavy metal tool, and his voice carried a threat that he would break the door down if she continued to stay silent. None of them understood that this door was no longer the only boundary between them and the truth. Evelyn had once been a woman overlooked within her own family. After her husband passed away, she stepped back and allowed her son and daughter-in-law to gradually take control of everything. They called it help, care, and family responsibility. But over time, questions about money, inheritance papers, and control of the house began to appear more frequently, like cracks that could no longer be ignored. Marcus often said he only wanted to protect his mother. Lillian always claimed she cared about Evelyn's future. Yet that care slowly turned into pressure that weighed on every decision Evelyn made. And then a small detail from the bank shifted everything. Unusual inquiries had been made into her accounts, even though no transactions had occurred. At the same time, fragments of conversations Evelyn had accidentally overheard began forming a disturbing picture she could no longer dismiss. In that moment, Evelyn finally understood that the issue was no longer about her children's concern. It was about the fact that they were beginning to see her as part of an estate rather than a person. And just outside the shaking door, driven by every heavy knock, the truth she was about to face had already begun to move. After that night, Evelyn's heart no longer slept peacefully. The words, the looks, and the increasingly controlling behavior from Marcus and Lillian were no longer vague impressions, but a clear chain of signs that forced her to face a truth she could not ignore. No one knew that from the very moment she chose silence in front of that shaking door in the morning, a different plan had already begun forming in her mind. Evelyn quietly reached out to Henry Cole, a retired financial investigator who still possessed the sharp instinct needed to trace what others would miss. It did not take long before Henry began uncovering fragments that shook Evelyn's entire world. Marcus had already met with a private attorney to ask about gaining control of assets in the event Evelyn was no longer able to make decisions for herself. Lillian, meanwhile, had been shaping a different image of Evelyn in private conversations, portraying her as someone weakening, someone who could soon be replaced. Worse still, there were signs they were not simply waiting. They were actively accelerating the process. As the truth slowly surfaced, Evelyn did not choose confrontation. She chose silence. But this was no longer the silence of a fragile woman. It was the silence of someone carefully observing every move of the people around her. She began restructuring everything connected to her estate. Every account was reviewed. Every document was checked with precision. The lakeside home, once a symbol of family warmth, now became the center of a carefully constructed plan to secure absolute legal control. And while Marcus and Lillian still believed they were moving closer to gaining what they wanted, in reality, they were walking deeper into a trap they had never even seen coming. That morning arrived faster than any other day in Evelyn Hart's memory. The air by the lake was still cold and motionless, yet that fragile silence was shattered at exactly 6 a.m. by violent pounding on the front door. Lillian stood on the porch, her voice trembling but laced with anger, repeatedly demanding to be let in and asking why her key no longer worked. Moments later, Marcus appeared. His face was flushed red, his breathing uneven, and in his hand he held a heavy metal tool. He shouted that no door should be able to keep him out of his own mother's house. Neighbors began to gather. Curious eyes followed every movement, every shouted word, every rising wave of tension that was quickly slipping out of control. But Evelyn was no longer the silent woman standing behind the curtain. She stood upright in the living room, her expression unnervingly calm. She did not rush to open the door. She waited. Then the sound of a car pulling up shattered the chaos completely. A lawyer stepped out alongside a retired judge and a local police officer. Their arrival made Marcus freeze instantly. Documents were opened right there in the yard. Evidence of financial monitoring, Plans to transfer control of assets, and private exchanges of intent were read aloud in front of everyone watching. There was no longer any place for the truth to hide. When the door finally opened, Evelyn stepped outside and looked directly at her son. Her voice was not loud, but it carried enough weight to silence the entire scene. She said that family cannot be used as ownership, and that trust, once replaced by greed, leaves no path back. Marcus and Lillian stood frozen. Not because they had lost a dispute, but because, in that moment, they realized they had lost something that could never be recovered.